Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Michael from Justuno, and I help run the partner marketing here. And today I'm joined by Tanya Plaza from dotdigital to talk about all things GDPR and data privacy in the EU. So, Tanya, do you want to give us a little bit about yourself and what dotdigital does?
Sure. So dotdigital is an omni-channel messaging platform. We send digital messages of all types, email, SMS, chat, and the likes of that. I have been in the industry for around 10 to 12 years. I'm, I'm not quite sure, but I've been in for a while. Been a little over 5 years with dotdigital, and it's my responsibility, my team's responsibilities to make sure that deliverability and compliance is taken care of. So I head up the deliverability and compliance initiatives that make sure that messages that are being sent arrive where they're supposed to go. And if not, we understand why and help make sure that the messages either get there or diagnose if there's a good reason that they're not getting through. We are responsible for making sure spam is minimized as much as possible and that only messages that recipients want to receive and have given consent for are being sent from our platform. I meant to mention something about that. I'm not a lawyer, so I have many years of working with senders in a looking at the different pieces of legislation around the globe. So CASL, CCPA, GDPR, very familiar with it, but I'm not a lawyer. So my information is simply to help. It's not intended as legal advice.
Great, thank you for that. So, on that note, with a merchant being outside of the EU, can they face penalties for non-compliance with GDPR, even if they aren't in Europe?
Yes, so pretty severe actually. So it could be up to 20 million euros or up to 4% of the global turnover. And again, while I am really familiar with the laws, there could be different specifics around this. But with what I've read in the law, um, reading the text, the pretty severe, tens of millions of euros if or up to 2% or up to 4%. It depends on the different section or what you violated, and um, uh, it's up to the national authorities.
Yeah, let's hop right into the questions. And the first one is, what is GDPR and what challenge does it pose for merchants looking to become fully compliant in all their marketing business?
So GDPR is the privacy legislation that's put in place to regulate how data is handled for any organization that does business in the EU. So it's important to note that it's not just for companies that reside in the EU, but it's also for companies that do business with the EU. And then also they need to use that GDPR legislation in conjunction with individual European Union member countries that have their own legislation to use alongside of the GDPR.
Gotcha.
So it's the privacy legislation that helps make sure that data is handled properly.
Can you give us a few specifics of the regulation? Just like some broad specifics of what is, like, say, most applicable?
Yes, sure. So, like the uh, other legislations that are in place, CCPA and CASA laws, they're intended to help legislate, well, CASA specifically for anti-spam, but help legislate how um, data is being used. Um, Along with CCPA, it gives residents certain rights, such as not having data sold, the right to be forgotten, the right to action. But what sets GDPR apart is the requirement for a legal basis to be sending, and so that's really what sets GDPR apart from the other major pieces of legislation that are out there.
Great.
Not talking about canned spam.
Sure. Uh, so yeah, actually on that note, does being GDPR compliant translate to being compliant with other major legislations like CCPA or CACF?
No, no. Each has their own set of complex pieces to the legislation. So it's going to be just because you're compliant with one of the different pieces of legislation doesn't mean you're compliant for the rest. However, even though they're different, you can definitely adopt a unified approach by focusing on best practices and consent and making sure that you're reaching for that gold standard, and you can definitely have that kind of approach, which will ensure that you are compliant with all three
Right.
or four or whatever or however many
Right. Right.
countries you're sending to.
Right. And with all the recent updates and just intense focus on data privacy, we can
Mhm.
potentially expect more down the road to get, further stringent, whatever it may
Yeah,
be.
yeah.
And so my last question for GDPR is, how does Brexit affect how the UK is managing that? Because GDPR is a EU regulation, and if they're, splitting off, how does that affect that?
Yeah, so right now it's complex but simple. It's led to there being a GDPR for the EU and then also a GDPR, a UK GDPR. Right now they're the same, but there's a possibility of divergence in the future. So it's just being aware that that could happen. But right now, the GDPR for the UK is the same as the EU GDPR.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, so they just sort of cloned it over and okay, right on. Cool, cool, cool. My next question is, what is important for merchants to know about GDPR if their business is not based in Europe, but they are selling and marketing to those in the EU or the UK?
They need to be compliant with GDPR. So it's important for them to know that the level of permission that's required by other countries, that includes Canada, so CASL as well, but the GDPR as well as other as well as the UK, even without having GDPR, they require consent. It just they have a much uh, narrower view of what constitutes consent, and different from the US, where the laws in the US, where we're an opt-out country, so that means it's legal to send to anyone as long as they haven't, as long as they have the ability to opt out or haven't opted out, with the CCPA adding a few other things in there. However, that is not the case for GDPR. There needs to be a legal basis for being able to send, and it also there needs to be consent for any kind of marketing message that's sent.
Yeah, spam is not allowed effectively via GDPR. I want to live in the EU. That sounds great. That's great.
Does sound great, doesn't it?
Yeah. And actually, yeah, a quick side question there is, if a company based outside of Europe and markets to GDPR, but does spam them without their consent and that sort of thing, and breaks GDPR regulations, uh, what sorts of penalties or otherwise could incur from that?
I probably won't get into the specifics around that, not because I don't want to, but because there have been the examples around it are varying. So it's going to depend on the country, that the member country of the European Union. So it will be different.
They can they country or businesses outside the EU can face penalties though for not
Yes.
complying. Okay.
Yes.
Basically,
Now, of course, it's going to be more challenging depending on where where that company is residing in, if it's in the U.S. or if it's somewhere else in Europe or if it's somewhere else in um, the world.
yeah,
But but yes, it doesn't mean that they won't take some sort of action.
fair enough. Great. Cool. So my last question for you is, what is the number one thing a merchant should do today to move towards a kind of like that unified compliant marketing strategy that you mentioned?
It's not going to be just one thing, but it's just an overall strategy towards. So there will be a couple of things that play into my answer here, but I would really encourage marketers to take a step back, use the resources that are available out there. There are many checklists. There are many websites out there that will help you, such as the dotdigital Trust Center, that has a lot of different pieces of information about GDPR. Um, that will help you get a good sense of where you're at. And then where there are unclear areas, that's when you need to get legal counsel involved, and make sure that you're actually uh, being compliant from a legal perspective, and having that backup from having a legal consultation. But the number one thing that will help is approaching the whole strategy by focusing on what the recipient experiences and how it complies with best practices. Keep in mind that all of these pieces of legislation are put in place to enforce best practices and it's the lowest minimum standard of what is being asked of senders in order to make sure that they're complying and respecting what recipients want, and making sure that the conversation is able to be controlled from both sides. So focusing on best practices will ensure that the recipient's needs are really being taken into priority. So I would say the number one thing would be to, after taking a step back and making sure that you're compliant, it's to actually focus on the recipient and what do they want to receive, instead of focusing on practices that seem attractive just because the law allows it. Look at how to build business with a long-term strategy that will help achieve long-term success, simply uh, rather than just simply making decisions based on what's legal, without going further to understand what recipients actually want.
That's a fantastic number one thing to keep in mind. Yeah, because no one wants, yeah, keeping the recipient, who your audience always in mind. Because if they don't have a good experience with you, then they're not gonna want to buy or work with you, right?
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's something that I come across a lot in conversations. We can get sidetracked very easily by hashing out all of the legalities of, oh, but my lawyer says this. Well, my legal counsel says this. Well, I think the law should be interpreted this way. And we're forgetting the focus. And the focus
Yeah.
is the recipient and how are you going to achieve maximum success by communicating with that recipient. And if you focus on that, um, and making sure that they're getting what they want and they've given consent, um, that's where you're really going to see growth.
So it's kind of a us versus them approach, which is the bad way. Like, I have to comply with these regulations. I have to do these things just to do this. Whereas
Mhm.
in reality, everyone's kind of on the same team. You want to send your message out to customers. They want to hear from you. They want
Yeah,
those deals, and they want to support you, but they just don't want to be bothered unfairly while you do it.
exactly. It's all about what does that recipient want, and we can get really ingrained in our perspective because this is what we do. We work with marketing. We work with as a sender. I've been a sender working for a brand in the past,
Mhm.
and you're really focused on why wouldn't somebody want to hear from me? But that's not the point. The point is, does that recipient want to hear from you? And then those legal pieces will fall into place. You do need to make sure you're being compliant. So I
Right.
have, however, the focus should be on what does that recipient want to hear.
So, with all of these regulations, I know some companies have a data privacy officer, a DPO. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on at what point in a brand's size or growth should they think about hiring a data privacy officer to help manage all the data they collect, which is, for especially these larger brands, a lot of data, a lot of user customer data.
Good question. So in reality, size doesn't really matter. In the GDPR in the UK and in the EU, both have conditions where you must appoint a DPO based on those conditions. So are you a public authority or body? Are your core activities, do they require large scale, regular and monitoring of individuals? So like behavior tracking and such.
Okay.
Do your core activities consist of large scale processing of different types of categories related to convictions or criminal offenses? Those are just some of the things that are specified in the UK from the ICO. However, it is definitely worth checking guidelines, and making sure that you're looking at those details, what they mean, and understand if they apply to you or not. But um, uh, it's always a good practice to have someone in the role, even voluntarily, to just make sure privacy is considered early.
Yeah, it's a big umbrella. So the sooner you get on it, the better, right? Because
Yeah.
you can't, especially with some of those privacy non-compliance cases, you really can't afford those fines and that thing. And especially if that comes out that you mishandled, your customer's data, whether you sold it, misused it, however, you're losing trust with your
Mhm.
customers there. And if you don't have trust, then that's
Yeah.
a huge issue for practically any company.
Yes.
Thank you, Tanya, for joining us today. We hope everyone learned a lot. And yeah, so thank you, Tanya, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.